presentación hoy va a ser en español. Oh, sorry. How many people speak Spanish? 3 or 4, 5, 6? Cool. Okay, well, hello. Hello. I'm here to talk a little bit about international searching or international sourcing, international research. The question that was asked is, why doesn't resume searching work the same everywhere else in the world? So I'm going to try and walk around the world if we can today in 20 minutes. Let me see a show of hands. How many people here have tried to do international sourcing? Okay. How many of you go do career fairs and other events in other countries? Okay. How many of you are currently here but you are not from the US? You're coming from other countries to be at this conference. Okay. What countries do we have represented?
Canada.
Canada?
England.
South Africa and England? Anything else? Australia. You're probably the one that came the furthest, huh? Excellent. Well, thank you. Okay, so there we go. Okay, a little bit about me. The reason I started out in Spanish, I was actually raised in Colombia, South America. So Spanish really is my first language. Believe it or not, as I stand here in front of you, English is my second language. I did take the TOEFL. I have a BS in International Business from RIT. Anybody know what RIT is? It's a technical school at upstate New York, Rochester Institute of Technology. I studied a lot of applied intercultural communications, cross-cultural communications, nonverbal communications. It was kind of a passion of mine when I was in college, and I didn't really get to apply much until the last couple of years when I got into recruiting and started getting involved with the international space. I studied a lot of the nonverbal communication in college, but I also did that formally with the Peace Corps. I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I did a full 27-month tour of duty. Some of the countries here, Canada, UK, you also have similar foreign service type of volunteer organizations. Is anybody not familiar with the Peace Corps? Okay, cool. When I was in the Peace Corps, I worked in Nicaragua. I also lived in Australia for some time. Where are you from? What part of Australia? Sydney? I used to live and work in Sydney. So I have a little bit of international experience actually having been there, but most of the stuff is because I conduct trainings and I also do some of the research currently at Microsoft. When I used to work at Google, I also did some international sourcing there, and also when I was at Cisco. So a little bit of experience in the field. And currently, in case you're wondering what I do now, I architect and I manage a team of researchers, and we do sourcing or lead generation, mostly US-based, but over the last couple of years, the team has started to take more of a global turn, and very recently, we're now actually involved with some of the global sourcing efforts. Why does resume mining and why do sourcing techniques not work just the same in other countries? There's a lot of different privacy practices. There are some countries, I believe, where you're not allowed to ask if someone has a degree. Is anybody here from a country where you're not allowed to ask that? Believe it or not, there are countries where you're not allowed to ask that. The CVs in other countries have photos, things like, for example, your marital status, your religious belief system, how many children you have, what other kinds of things are on CVs in South Africa and UK that you wouldn't find here? Volunteer organizations, affirmative action, information, yep. So, age, that's good, yeah, that's right. So all these cultures have different standards. It makes direct sourcing kind of tricky. If you're in the US and you're sourcing from these countries, you have to be mindful of US practices. If you're a US company sourcing abroad in other countries for your organization, you have to be mindful of course, those cultural changes as well. Some cultures consider solicitation to be really rude. For example, if I was to call you as a recruiter, if I was to call you at work and say, hey, I have an opportunity I want to talk to you about, raise your hand if in your country that would be considered a little off or a little unusual. No? There are some countries in the world where that would be inappropriate. And not necessarily, evil or bad, but just inappropriate. Not something that's commonly done. A lot of that has to do with it hasn't been practiced a lot, but a lot of it also has to do with local culture. Recruiting by phone is less effective in other countries because in some countries they prefer face-to-face. If you do business in Latin America, face-to-face meetings are a lot more important. Having actual face time is considered a little bit more businessy than a phone call. In fact, people will actually chit-chat on the phone and make an appointment to meet in person to do business. Anybody here from Latin America? Original? Okay, hitting a lot of zeros today. We'll keep going. Internet use is increasing worldwide. We see the numbers, we see the graphs, more and more people using the internet. But blogging, what Joel was talking about, and some of the online living, for example, online entertainment and things like that, aren't growing as quickly as the charts say they are, because the internet usage is growing, but in other countries, people don't blog nearly as much. Who said are you the only one from Australia?
Well, I'm from Venezuela originally.
Oh, okay. From Venezuela, but a couple of people from Australia.
Yeah.
How many blogs have you seen that are Australian citizens talking about Australian things on Australian blogs?
Thousands?
Thousands? Okay. Culturally, is it considered the same as here in the US? Or is there a little bit of a different opinion of people who blog or the blogging concept in general?
It's less developed as a sort of commercial tool for branding, so there's very few sort of that would have the same sort of following as some large-scale American.
So the individual blog that Joel was talking about is relatively fewer or rare.
Yeah, I
Okay?
think it's sort of more, person-to-person, what I did on the weekend style in terms of overall message.
More like I'm keeping a journal for my friends online. How about South Africa?
It tends to be related to the technical.
Okay.
Development.
Right, okay, thank you. So mostly, if there are some, there are fewer, but the ones that are tend to be very technical.
Yeah, that tends to be enough development.
What do South Africans think of, like, MySpace, for example? How do they observe that as a phenomenon?
I don't think many of them know much about it.
Would it be a little odd? Like, would they say, why would people want to share all that information?
Yeah,
Because the privacy laws are a little different, and the culture is also a little bit more reserved, more private, right?
they're a lot more conservative.
A lot more conservative, okay. People from other cultures are often perplexed at our willingness in this country to share this kind of information. South Africa is not the only example. In other countries, they look at these blogs and they go, why are these people sharing all this personal information about themselves and their jobs? They don't understand it. Now, they may eventually, that's something that's certainly growing, but right now, when we try to do international sourcing, we have to be mindful that this kind of amount of information is unusual to people from other cultures and other countries. Meeting people halfway is much more effective than having them turn to your point of view. What I'm trying to say is, if you understand a little bit about how conservative South African culture is, or how liberal, for example, Australian culture, is that a fair statement?
Yeah.
Australian culture is, you might do better off by kind of moving yourself out of your comfort zone when you're going to Australia and be a little bit more liberal or a little bit more conservative when you're going to South Africa. Generally speaking, as a recruiter in business, you definitely want to participate a little bit more in their cultural practices instead of expecting them to understand yours and come to meet you at your cultural practices. Before you formulate a strategy for each country or region of the world that you're recruiting for, it's good to read up on some of the nuances for that culture. It's very easy to make the false assumption that because South Africans speak English and Australians speak English, they think exactly like we do. Quite the contrary. If you go to Australia or if you go to South Africa, you'll see that although the communication barriers aren't necessarily there because they understand very clearly what we're saying, sometimes what we say puts them off a little bit. And they might not tell you that because they're trying to understand where you come from. But a lot of us forget that we should also try to understand where they're coming from. So it's good to read up on that kind of stuff before we travel. This slide here is representative of what I call the melting pot. Now, the melting pot is something that we all study in college when we're talking about international business. Does everybody know what the melting pot is? Yeah, pretty much. Okay. There was this census back in 2001. I understand it's a little bit dated, but the world as a population hasn't really changed that much. It's grown, but the demographics haven't changed that much. If the world was a village of 1,000 people, 607 of them would be Asian. 132, the second largest group, would be African. And you can see the rest of the pies, the slices in that pie. So you can see the distribution of population throughout the world. This isn't just Asians in Asian countries, okay? This is Asians, period, wherever they happen to be. Africans, wherever they happen to be, whether they're in their native country or in somewhere else. So this is the representation of, for example, this room. Now this room might be a little bit different because we're all coming from kind of the same industry, but if you took a representative sample on a street in New York, you might find something similar to this pie. Religious people that have religious beliefs, or at least responded to the census religious questions, we would see that about 330 of those 1,000 are Christian of some form. There's, of course, Catholic, Protestant, and other types of Christian. And then there'd be 193 that are Muslim. Chinese folk religious people would be 64, and 103 are atheists. So, especially when you're talking about culture, religion has a deep impact in that. There's a lot of belief systems that are affected in business by religion. I know that sometimes sounds a little strange to people in the US, but believe it or not, if you go do business in, for example, the Middle East, you certainly have to pay attention to this. So here's some examples of things to talk about. So I'm going to pose this up to the Australians. In Australia, do Australians respect people with strong opinions even if they don't agree? Is that a fair statement? Obviously, this is kind of a stereotype, not necessarily a stereotype, but this is more of a generally accepted cultural nuance. Doesn't mean that every Australian is going to respect your strong opinion, right? But generally speaking, is that true? How about South Africa? Is South Africa out there? No, I have you on a different slide, I'm sorry. Anybody here from the Netherlands? No? Greece? How about France? Anybody here lived or worked in France? Does that sound true to you? The French don't tell or like to hear jokes? Does that make sense? They'd rather have sort of anecdotal humor, right? Anybody else represented up in here? Is there anybody from India or that's lived and worked in India quite a bit? Does that?
Yeah, that's about right.
That's about right. The source for this, I realize this is actually pretty low on the slide. I don't know if many of you can see it, but it should be on your presentation slides. Is this Window on the World online website where they actually list all these countries and they talk about some of these things to watch out for when you're conducting business in those countries. So before you start doing any recruiting in another country, it's good to read up on this. A little bit of this is going to go a long way. I want to talk for a second about intercultural communication. I don't know how many of you know about Gerd Hofstede's dimensions. Are you familiar with that? Has anybody read that book or read those studies? What he did was he kind of put together, you're familiar with like Jungian types, ENTP, ENTJ, all that stuff. He sort of did something similar, but for cultures throughout the world. And from a website called Cyberlink, and from there you can see a link to his homepage as well. You can see all these dimensions that also give you a little bit more insight as to the culture and the way that these countries behave socially. Why this is important is because those traits carry over into business, clearly. Another couple of websites I want to direct you to is there's a lot of information from the government on both the export.gov, which I believe is part of the State Department, that goes country by country and talks a lot about conducting business in that country. And also on the state.gov site, they have some additional resources about the economics, labor statistics, things that might be of interest for you. When I create strategies for each one of these countries, I consider the region and I create a separate strategy for each region. You may not necessarily have the same recruiting strategy as you have a sourcing strategy. Why would that be? Why would there be a different recruiting strategy and sourcing strategy? Anybody?
Your approach needs to be different.
When you're recruiting or sourcing, or both?
Oh.
Definitely your approach. So as a recruiter, if you're going to physically go there and actually interview, certain things like, for example, in some countries, it's very impolite to show the bottom of your shoe. I believe, is that in Australia, in South Africa?
No, that's Middle East.
Middle Eastern? So, what's that?
It's in the Arabic countries.
In Arabic countries. Okay, so that would be something that as a recruiter, you want to be very mindful of, not to cross your legs in a meeting and people can see the bottom of your shoe. It's very, very rude. As a sourcer, that doesn't matter because you're not going to go there. You're just going to gather information. So as a sourcer, you might have strategies for different areas of the world depending on the types of information that's available on the internet, what's considered acceptable, use of internet information, things like that, versus as recruiters, you might have different strategies related to how you interview, who you contact. We're going to talk about a couple of case studies. Here's some ideas on things that you might want to do. Forge relationships with the local gatekeepers. For example, university professors. Some universities have sort of a cultural center around their education system where the professors become centers of attention. And you can ask them questions like, what are the top schools in your opinion? Are they public? Are they private? What's their selection process? How do they make decisions? This may be important, clearly, if you're recruiting from college. But believe it or not, this also affects beliefs 5 years, 10 years later. So it's very important to understand this, even if you're not directly recruiting from college. How many of you actually do college recruiting overseas? 1 or 2? So most of the other people that said that they were recruiting overseas right now, you're recruiting experienced hires, right? Even in those cases, you certainly want to make connections with these gatekeepers. Not just college professors, but also chambers of business, chambers of commerce, diplomatic organizations, diplomatic corps. They'll be able to assist you in understanding the culture. Some of you might have local offices there. How many of you that have US-based corporations actually have operations in some other countries where there's an HR department or at least representative? Raise your hand. Have you spoken with them about recruiting practices? That's a really good source because they'll be connected to hopefully some of these other resources as well as, of course, understand the labor market quite well. If they don't, there's a couple of other places you can go to. Another thing, when you're doing direct sourcing or direct recruiting, instead of trying to direct source, I have a bullet point up here, try the safer alternative of making an introduction. So in some countries, it's not as acceptable for me to say, call you and make a cold call, like we do here. Joel said he called me somewhat of a bulldog. That's because we actually take a lot of initiative in making the call when we try to identify talent. That may not necessarily be as appropriate in other countries, but if you're just saying, hey, I want to make an introduction and I want to understand the environment, the culture, I want to get to know business in this country, it's a lot softer of a call. It's not necessarily a cold call. It's more of a business call, trying to explore the environment. Joel also mentioned SMS. If cell phones are very common in your target country, this might be a practice that's accepted. How many of you, from the ones that said that you came from Europe, how many of you use SMS more than your voicemail? Okay, how about here in the US? How many of you actually use SMS? So there's a few people. Now this is becoming more and more practice. Right now, there's still a cost attached to sending and receiving SMS messages, but eventually that will become part of just having a cell phone package. And I believe in the UK, David, is it true in the UK pretty much SMS just is a standard, comes with the phone?
Oh, absolutely. And for kids particularly, texting is the way to communicate.
And as they grow up and become business people, that's going to be the way to get in touch with them. So these kinds of phenomenons are occurring already. Perhaps SMS may become more important than internet, depending on the country. Maybe in the UK, maybe not in other countries.
I think, if I may interject,
Yes?
I think the supported messaging is a very important tool, but not necessarily SMS.
Oh, okay. So what other
In
kinds?
South Africa, we've got something called Mixing.
Oh, okay.
That is about 600 times cheaper than SMS.
And is it
It's an
cell phone based?
Yes, it's an application. It sits on your cell phone. And what you do is you use the GPRS network, which is much cheaper than the voice which SMS uses.
So it's almost like a cell phone email.
Yeah, it's exactly what it is. That's
Okay.
exactly what it is. And that, we believe, I mean, in comparison, an SMS costs 60 cents, whereas this is less than 2 cents.
Wow, okay, so that's significant.
It's significant, and all the kids are using it, so all of them.
So there's another cultural phenomenon just like that. So again, the technology is growing, but not necessarily the same way that it grew here. Here's some case studies and some things. When we had some sourcing, some recruiting in Russia, Romania, and Ukraine, we got very, very little response to email, particularly at work. It was almost like kind of a dead zone. We got no replies, very few replies. Couldn't really understand why that is. Anybody want to take a guess as to why that happened?
They're afraid of the government.
It was like fear. Definitely it was fear. We don't really know if it was because they thought we were government. It's kind of odd to think that coming from a corporation, but that might be part of it. We definitely think it was fear related or suspicion. They were suspicious. They didn't really know what to think about it. It was easy to find information about them, unfortunately. I say unfortunately because we found lots and lots of information with bios and profiles and email addresses, but then when we emailed everybody, we got nothing back. So it was easy to find it, but it was very difficult to get in touch with them. In China, some online information is written in English, so it was easy for us to go out and identify information about local talent in English. They were writing their resumes, for example, their CVs in English, even though they may not necessarily be very comfortable speaking English. It's just kind of an accepted thing, I guess, for business purposes. So understanding the culture in China was also very important because having conversations with Chinese candidates was very different. There's certain things they say that mean something else, that have a different innuendo than what we would expect being, English-speaking Americans. They also prefer to have kind of the last word in a conversation, and by that I don't mean like the last word in an argument, like there's always that person that wants to say the last thing right as you're walking out the door in an argument. But the last word as in like, they always want to be the one that says, okay, thank you very much, and then leave. They want to be the ones to kind of finish the conversation. It's a politeness thing, so it's very important to allow them to do that and not try to overpower them when they're in a conversation and always try to have the last word yourself, because then they're going to say, oh, thank you, no, thank you, no, thank you, oh, no, thank you, no, thank you. And that's how you end up in those, you've probably seen the jokes about how that happens in Asian cultures, is because they want to be the ones to say thank you last. So something as subtle as that can make somebody very uncomfortable. In South Africa, the direct email response rate was low. Not as low as in Russia and Ukraine, but it was lower compared to some of the other countries that we worked on. They responded better when we were introduced. So if an email that I sent to a South African candidate or potential candidate was forwarded by a professor, they were a lot more likely to get back to me than if I emailed that person directly. Any idea why that might be? I don't think. Have you experienced that yourself?
We send out over 1 million emails a month.
To candidates?
Yeah.
And you get direct responses? We found our response rates better when they were forwarded, for whatever reason. So some of these things, I can't necessarily explain.
Maybe it's your brand.
They could be the brand, yep.
Sorry.
Absolutely, but that's another consideration. Your brand perception in that country may be different than what you expect.
Brand makes it almost.
So, the professor might have been able to tell me what may or may not be the case with my brand. In Australia, direct phone calls worked really well. Prospects are very approachable, but they're very used to working with agencies. Anybody know how many percentage of the jobs are filled through agencies versus direct corporate recruiters?
It was 80 and now it's about mid-70s, 70%.
It used to be 80, getting closer to 60. You're saying about 70 now?
Yeah.
Here in the US, for example, it's close to 30, even less, and it's declining. If you talk to industry experts like Jerry Crispin, he'll tell you that it's been declining pretty steadily, and it's now in the 30s or even lower, but in Australia, it's in the 70s or 60s. So, as you can imagine, they're used to working with a third-party headhunter, even though they were very receptive to our calls. It's not like they were, hanging up the phone on us. They just were kind of taken aback, like, oh, you actually work for the company? That's interesting. In Germany, the searches in German yielded extremely better results. When we did searches for Lebenslauf, the German translation for resume, the quality of results was phenomenally better than if we tried to do searches for English words, looking for English CVs and things like that. So the language barrier in Germany was significant, at least on the internet. They certainly spoke English when we talked to them, and that was okay to communicate with them, but we found the resumes better, easier, faster, better quality resumes when we used German language words to keyword search. Direct recruiting trends were viewed a little bit negatively. They were sort of embarrassed or not comfortable talking with us directly about recruiting. However, it's very interesting. They were very, very comfortable with direct personal questions. The kind of questions that we would ask here in the States about business. Personal, I mean business related. Career objectives and that kind of things. They were very, very comfortable about that. They were just kind of taken aback at the fact that we called them. Sort of almost like a coldness on the phone initially, until they understood what was going on. So, very different. In Latin America, we found the face-to-face is much more preferred. Introductions and referrals work better. That doesn't mean that you can't talk to people directly, but the introductions and the referrals, the relationships, this is my friend or this is my associate, went a lot further and got us a lot more candidates, a lot more leads than if we tried to go in directly. And another thing that we found about Latin America is that email tends to be casual. Less casual. So when you send out an email, like here in the US, you might say, hey, how's it going? And apostrophe and maybe the happy face or smiley face or whatever. Not the case in Latin America. They don't necessarily see that way. With email, they see it more of a formal document. It's almost like a letter. They even have their emails, a lot of times are formatted like a memo. Subject and to, and in reference, and copy, and all that. So it almost looks like a letter. So for whatever reason, they treat email a lot more formally than we would in the States, where it's almost kind of just chat. Here's some facts on international job board usage. This came from top job sites. You probably can't see it at the bottom, but it should be in the printout. Some statistics on, very interesting, 51 Job, which is a Chinese job board, is ranked 132nd by Alexa. That means out of all the sites Alexa ranks, 51 Job is the 132nd, out of millions and millions and millions. And it's ranked, as you can see, significantly higher than Monster. Monster, by the way, is declining. A few months ago, if I had done this maybe 6 months ago, Monster would have been at about 121. Now you can see it's at 190. 51 Job and China HR and Zhaopin, all Chinese sites, are all three in the top 5 Chinese job boards. Very interesting phenomenon. Of course, Monster, Career Builder are up there. A couple of other interesting sites that you see up there in the Kuri in India. I'm probably not pronouncing that right. And then there's Seek in Australia and New Zealand. I believe Seek is from New Zealand, but it's also grown a lot in Australia, has a significant presence. To be 1,900 worldwide, that's a lot of traffic, considering it's an Australian New Zealand job board. It's still 1,900 in the world ranked by Alexa. As you get lower down the list here, you see things like Job Pilot in the UK and Job Center Plus are not ranked as high. The population in the UK, interestingly, is a lot more online. There are a lot more people online in the UK and Canada than most other countries, but the job boards aren't quite as popular there for whatever reason. There's a lower ratio of resumes to jobs, so a lot more jobs, a lot fewer resumes posted in international sites versus people posting their resume on Monster here. They do that less frequently abroad in other countries. One of the things that I did to find some intelligence on local culture was I went to the CIA World Factbook. They keep basically an encyclopedia, practically, of all the countries that they follow. And in the information, I think there's 200, I want to say something in the 260 countries. That number changes, obviously, because sometimes countries split into 2, so that's happening quite a bit. But they'll track information like population, unemployment rates, very, very important stuff when you're going to recruit in that country. They also talk about the distribution of labor, agriculture versus industry versus services. The number of telephone lines and the number of cellular lines in some countries, very significant difference. 1 million telephone lines, 10 million cell phone lines. Very big difference. And the number of internet hosts versus users is also different. Here's an example of some of the statistics and how they compare. These two countries, South Africa and the Ukraine, have about the same amount of population, 44 million and 46 million, I believe, yeah, 46.7 million. In South Africa, there are 50 million people in the workforce according to the fact book. That may be a little out of date, but I'm not really sure if it's 2005 or 2004. It's recent enough that it's important. However, the data for both countries is the same. So in the Ukraine, 22.6 million versus 15 million in South Africa. You can see the distribution of labor and the unemployment rate being much higher in South Africa. 26% versus 9 to 10% in the Ukraine. Cellular phones, 19 million in South Africa, 13 million in the UK. But telephone lines, South Africa has far fewer, which I thought was very interesting. So they use cell phones a lot more than home phone numbers or landlines. Because there's more online users, it might be easier to reach people in the Ukraine. Because there's a lot more internet users. Now the hosts, you can see, there's only 167,000 hosts in the UK, but 5.2 million users. Versus a lot more hosts in South Africa, like university servers and things like that, but fewer users. So what that means is there's less computers that are connected to the internet, but more internet users in the Ukraine, which I thought was a very interesting statistic. We were able to find a lot of information about people in the Ukraine online. Resumes, bios, CVs. They had their pages where they had their email address and their degree, and competitions they had entered, and things like that. So very, very interesting data. Another thing is the country codes and top-level domains is one of the ways that we search. These are some ideas on things that we use to search. We search by ISP. We find local ISPs, and we try to penetrate pages that are hosted by that ISP. We also try to find pages that have top-level domains in those countries and phone area codes in those countries. So, for example, Australia is 6-2, right? And 6-1, and Sydney is 2. So if you did a search for 6-1 space 2, you'd find Australian residents. South Africa is 5-9? 2-7, and then what are the city codes like? Single digits or?
2 digits.
So 2712 might be a different city, and if you did a search for that, you'd find Johannesburg or something like that. Victoria, okay. Oh, Pretoria. Pretoria, right? Okay. We also use country-specific search engines. Here's a list of some of the bigger ones. Now, if they made it on this list, that means that they're very highly ranked. That doesn't mean they're the only one. In other words, Australia doesn't just have one search engine. It actually has a couple of dozen, but Census happens to be the biggest one. We also use the local versions of the top 3. MSN, Yahoo, and Google have local versions of the search engine. We use those when we're going to search for those countries. You can see the full list at Search Engine Colossus. Now, if you find some information and you can't read it, there's a lot of translation resources. We've listed out on this page a bunch of places you can go to translate. If you have the Google toolbar, you can right-click on a page and instantly translate it if it's a recognized language. If not, you can go to places like freetranslation.com or World Lingo and do a lot more extensive translation. They have dozens more languages than Google and Yahoo have. Yahoo, by the way, is the old Dabblefish. Anybody remember Alta Vista's Dabblefish? It's now dabble.yahoo.com. And then there's some dictionaries. These are actually word-to-word translations. So remember when I used Lebenslauf for Germany? This is where I got it from. I actually went to the dictionary and looked up resume, and it says in German, it's Lebenslauf. If you use a translation tool, it translates resume, which is a different word than resume. So what I want to do now is take some questions. How much time do we have for Q&A?
5 minutes.
5 minutes? Great. Any questions about international sourcing or what we did? Yeah?
Just got one quick question. You mentioned 30% of fake news in the US are placed by our agencies.
That's a ballpark figure.
Yeah, I mean, is that something to do with certain sectors and maybe certain job roles, job levels?
That's kind of overall. So if you looked at the global executive to entry level, professional, and you sort of took an average, in different levels it's going to be much higher. In executive, it's going to be a higher percentage, and in entry level it's going to be a significantly lower percentage. But if you were to take the global average, it would be about 30. The same thing happens in Australia. The global average is about 60 or 70, even though with executive it's probably closer to 90. And with entry level, it could approach 0.
Thanks.
We have some questions back there.
I'm sorry. Can you provide a little more detail on your sourcing approach? For example, doing IP searches relative to country code, relative to job boards?
Yes. Actually, I'm going to have a webinar on September 22nd on international sourcing. It's a 1-hour webinar, and it goes into specifics about how to use top-level domains, how to use specific field search commands on search engines, and how to use the phone codes, and of course the ISPs. Basically what we do is we use search engines to crawl these specific keywords, like 61 space 2 would be a phone number in Sydney. 61 is the country code, 2 is the city code. Or the site:/AU, which is the top-level domain for Australia. Now, by the way, top-level domains coincide with ISO 2-letter country codes, for the most part. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, if you're familiar with ISO, they have the 2-letter country codes. Those actually happen to be also top-level domains. But I encourage you to go to jobmachine.net, J-O-B, machine.net, and we're going to have the Cyber Sleuthing International Sourcing webinar on September 22nd. You also might want to sign up for the mailing list while you're there. We're going to put out an international sourcing cheat sheet. Some of you might have heard of the Google cheat sheet that I produced. We're coming out with an international sourcing cheat sheet similar to that, and we just launched a LinkedIn cheat sheet today.
Okay, one more question.
There was somebody back there.
Hi, Shally. Good morning.
Morning.
I'm just wondering how bi, tri, and quadlingual recruiters factor into your global recruitment strategies.
For recruiting purposes, much more effective. Remember I said you want to separate recruiting versus sourcing? It isn't as important to have tri and quadlingual sourcers as it is to have the recruiters, because when they go on-site to the country, they're going to be a lot more comfortable kind of breaking the ice in the local languages or dialects, a lot more so than the sourcers, who don't really need to initiate communication. Also, the sourcers have translation resources at their disposal, so they can understand a page of text through translation tools without necessarily needing to speak the language. So the answer is, your sourcers don't necessarily need to be bi or tri or quadlingual, but your recruiters should definitely have an advantage if they are. However, if you're a US-based company and you're recruiting people back to the US, or an Australian-based company or South African-based company, obviously these people are going to need to eventually learn English or speak English in order to work there. So it doesn't pose too much of a barrier. If you're a foreign organization recruiting in a country, like for example in the US, and you're coming from China to recruit here, again, the same issue. So it's not necessarily always a challenge, it's certainly an advantage.
Super. Excellent. Thank you, Shally.
Oh, thank you, everybody. I'll be around if you have any questions.